Hi guys, Ross here and welcome back to another video. So in today's video, we're going to be going over a number of things in setting up this garment scene in Cinema 4D. So we're going to be going over cameras, lights, textures, and then when it comes to texturing, we're going to be talking about vertex maps, polygon selections, how we can use them to layer up the material and create a bunch of different types of materials such as refractive materials, metallic and fabric materials. This is actually a snippet from a collaboration I did with Steffi Fung where we actually went through setting up this garment in Clo 3D and then bringing it into Cinema 4D to create this scene. So if you want to watch the full process, you can do that over on Patreon, but if not, enjoy this video. There's a lot packed into this one, so I'm super excited to share it with you and I hope you enjoy. Boom. Okay, so I've just brought in the alembic, which Steffi ended up with on her part of the tutorial, and I've just brought it into a composition which I've prepared for my part of the tutorial. Now, I haven't lit or textured anything, so that's what we're going to focus on today, and obviously focus on the texturing for the garment. And I've got a practice run I made here, so this is what we're going to strive for by the end of the tutorial. Hopefully you guys don't mind me not covering the build of this composition. It's fairly simple. It's just some cubes in some cloners, same for the side, same for the top, and then this archway here is just a cube with a rectangular shape kind of booleaned out of it. It's really nothing fancy. I think the magic here is really going to be in the lighting and the texturing, and that's what I wanted to focus today's tutorial on, and that's what I think is going to be the most valuable. The first thing we're going to look at is the garment, and then we can kind of build the composition around that. Now obviously before we do that, we need to have some sort of lighting. You can see if I press play on the render view, it's just going to be this very flat look, which is because we have no lighting. So let's just start off with a good old dome light. Now I've got mine docked at the top here, but you can grab yours from the menu down here on the right by selecting dome light, or by going up to the top and going Redshift, lights and dome light. So there's a few ways to get there. And by the way, if you don't have Redshift at the top, you just need to go into your preferences, go to Redshift and make sure you have a Redshift main menu enabled. You can see if I disable it, it's going to disappear. If I enable it, it's back. The other thing you need to do is you need to make sure your renderer is set to Redshift. Otherwise, again, it's not going to be there. So just make sure you've got these things set up and you should be good to go. One thing before we dive into the lighting, at the end of Steffi's tutorial, she actually added a subdivision surface to the garment. I'm going to do this through a Redshift object tag instead. That way we can subdivide it in the render view whilst keeping it low poly in the viewport. And we can do that just by going to geometry, overriding the geometry and enabling tessellation. So that one, keep it nice and subdivided in the render view, but keep it low poly in the viewport. The other thing I'll do is I'll remove subdivisions from the cloth surface because this actually will subdivide it again. So we don't need that many subdivisions. But I'm just going to take that off the cloth surface and have it purely running through the Redshift object tag. That should keep things a little bit quicker and stop my PC from going up in flames. Okay, so we've got the dome light in, and I'm going to grab a good old trusty HDR from Maxim Roz. It's kind of a running joke now that I always use these, but they're just so good that I can't help myself. So I'm going to go for this bathroom HDR, just drop this in, and this is going to give us some nice lighting straight off the bat. Move the dome light into the view of the camera, and then let's press R for rotate and just rotate this around until we get some nice light coming through. And I actually want it to come through the archway, so I'm going to rotate this around, maybe something like this, and then rotate it down slightly. And I'm actually going to boost the exposure to 2. Let's see how this looks. Give it a second of update. And there we go, that's a bit brighter. Now that's good for like kind of the base lighting, but the garment still doesn't have too much light hitting it. So what I actually am going to do in this case is add an additional area light just to really boost the brightness of the light coming through that archway. So let's lock the render view in place by pressing the lock button, and we'll dive out of the camera. And you can see this is kind of the composition setup we have. Really nothing too fancy, just a floor and some walls. But let's grab an area light quickly. We'll move this over, press R for rotate, hold shift to rotate in increments of 5 so we can rotate in 90 degrees. And I'm actually going to disable the dome light for now, just so I can purely focus on this area light and see what it's doing. And by default, it's giving us this very soft look. I want the lighting to be a bit harsher and have more contrast to it. So first of all, I'm going to raise it up and I'm going to rotate it down. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to go to the area light settings and turn the spread down to something like 0.1. And what that's going to do is that's going to focus the direction of the light. And you can see now we're getting much harsher lighting, much harsher shadows, and that's also just going to help to make things appear much more vibrant and contrasty, if that's even a word. So let's take this area light and we can drop this way down. We can even go something like 8 intensity, see how that looks, because this is obviously super bright at the moment. And let's maybe even drop the exposure to something like -1, because the way I like to look at it is, at the moment we're viewing this render view in regular mode, but if I went to clay, what I like to have is the lighting to be a similar shade of gray to what this preview icon is here, which I believe is about 50% gray. If I was to turn the exposure up to back to 0, for example, we give that a second to update, you can see that's actually quite bright compared to kind of the 50% gray we're getting here. So I like to keep things a lot more balanced, and that way I've got a bit of wiggle room if I want to push and pull any highlights or shadows in post-production. So let's set that at -1, 8 intensity, and then let's combine that with our dome light, and let's just put this back to regular. And what we should see now with the additional area light we've added is that it just adds a bit more brightness to the garment because it's shining right on the back, and also fills the inside of that archway a little bit. Now we've got the basic lighting set up, let's look at texturing this garment. And I'm actually going to create a duplicate camera, so I'm going to control drag it, and I'm using quite a high focal length on this camera of 150mm, and that's because I quite like the look and feel of this flatter perspective. You can see if I was to just change this to something like 36mm and I was to zoom in to roughly the same level, you can see we have a lot more perspective. It just doesn't feel as isometric, which I quite liked the feel of in this particular piece. You can see there how much that really changes between a 36mm focal length and a 150. It really just takes all that perspective out, and I quite like the look of it. So we're going with this quite high focal length, but I am going to control drag it, and I'll just create one which is a bit more zoomed in so we can really pick up on the details of the garment whilst we're making it. So let's focus on building kind of like the base fabric texture, and then we can look at how we can isolate different materials to different sections of this garment. Okay, let's unlock the render view. So now we should be seeing the updated camera. This is just taking a quick minute to update, that's okay. And as Steffi explained in the final part of her tutorial, we have these polygon selections with these different materials. This is a great way to work, but I actually want to talk about a different method we can use where we can actually have all the different materials in just one Redshift material. So I'm actually going to delete everything in this project file, even all these kind of included materials, and let's just delete them over here as well. And let's just double click in the render view. And I think what I'm going to do just for the time being is I'm going to hide this environment. So let's just hide everything apart from the garment and these spheres. Let's get rid of those as well. And I'm hoping this is just going to help to speed things up a little bit because it is being a little bit slow. That could partially be due to the cloth surface as well. I'm also going to remove the background from the dome light. Okay, so now we can focus purely on our garment. So let's apply this new material to our garment. So we'll just drag and drop that onto the cloth surface. I am going to disable the cloth surface just because it is being quite slow. So let's just disable that. That might help to keep things a little bit quicker. We could also drop down the maximum subdivisions. So let's change the maximum subdivisions to 1, so that will only subdivide it once, and you can see straight away that speeding it up, it still looks nice and smooth. I think I'm going to take the saturation out of the dome light as well, just because I can see kind of like a blue rim on the garment and I don't want it to tint the materials at all. We can always dial this back in afterwards. Okay, so we have this gray kind of silky material applied to our garment now, and let's turn this into a fabric material. Now the basic kind of building blocks of this material is going to be from a fabric texture from ambientcg.com. Now this is a really good website because everything on it is completely copyright free, meaning that you can use it for personal and for client work as well. As well as materials, they also have assets and HDRs on here, so I would definitely recommend checking it out. I'm going to be using fabric 18, but they have a bunch of other fabrics on there, so if you wanted to go for a slightly different look or slightly different type of garment, I'm sure there's a texture on here that you can check out. I've downloaded the 4K PNG, so I'm just going to load that up, Fabric 18, and let's drop in the color, the displacement, the normal, and the roughness. So we got all the materials in here, and if I was to press the S button on this color node here, or the texture node, we should see our fabric across our garment. Now at the moment it's way too big, so we obviously want to scale this down, and we can pretty easily do that just by scrolling down to the remap section of our texture, and you actually want to increase the number, because the way I like to think of this is that scale is actually the amount of tiles. So at the moment, because it's set to 1, there's going to be no tiling. But if I was to set both of these to 2, now there's going to be one set of tiles. So essentially it's half to the size of the texture. Now we can just keep increasing this number until we get to a scale which we think is suitable. And I think something like 15 works. If I was to zoom in closer, we can get a look at this and see if we think it's the right size. And I would say that's roughly about right. Obviously you could dial this in, but I think 15's good for now. Obviously we want to do the same for the others. And we could just select them all and change it to 15, but we could also double click to bring up our node menu or press C. And we want to type in abs. And this is going to allow us to put in a value in here. So we could actually pipe this into the general UV remap and scale and do this for all of these. UV remap scale. And now we could put 15 into this. And this is now going to change that scale for all of them. And you can see that now on this scale section is controlled by that node we've set up. So this is a really easy way just to have kind of one node to control all the textures. So let's start building this material. We want to use this normal map to get some details in the actual fabric. So let's get a bump map and we'll plug this normal map into the bump map and then output this into the bump map. And let's just unsolo the node quickly. If I was to zoom in even further, again, I'm just going to drag the camera and just make a more zoomed in version. You can see even without the diffused texture being plugged in, we're getting that fabric texture come through from the normal map. Now, one thing we have to be wary of is that because we are using a normal map, we need to make sure we change the bump map node to tangent space normal. And that should update the look of the normal map and we should get a little bit more detail. There we go, that looks much, much better. The next thing we need to do is we need to change the color space from auto to raw. And this is the case with any kind of texture which is being used to drive data, such as a roughness map, a normal map, a displacement map, or anything that's black and white essentially. So you can see from changing it from auto to raw, we get now a completely different look again. This is looking much more realistic. I think we could probably tone down the bump map to something like 0.5 because we are also going to use the displacement map to add some additional detail. So we put that down to 0.5 and you can see it's kind of breaking up the reflections already and it's already starting to get kind of that fabric feel to it. Let's do the same for the displacement. So let's just get a displacement node and we'll plug our texture into displacement, into input texture and text map. This doesn't actually go into the material, it goes into the output. So we need to wire this into displacement over here. At first, nothing's going to happen, and that's because in order for this to work, we need to go to our Redshift object tag and enable displacement. And now we can see the displacement enabled. I'm actually going to bump the scale up to something like 2 just to make that even more prominent and really pick out that kind of bump texture and make it feel really tactile. And that is looking pretty good. So the next thing we notice is that we still have quite a glossy feel to the fabric. You can see it's getting some kind of shiny parts in it, which doesn't feel very natural to fabric. And the great thing about the new standard material in Redshift is that we have this new parameter called sheen. Now, what this basically does is it gives a similar effect to reflection, but it gives you more of a backscatter effect. If I open up the Redshift documentation, they give you a really good example of how this works. If I just type in sheen and go to standard material and sheen, give it a second to load the images, and you can see here the difference between a cloth with sheen and without sheen. And you can see from the description, it says it simulates a soft backscatter effect commonly seen on fabrics like velvet or satin. We can use this to make our fabrics feel more realistic. So I'm actually going to disable reflection entirely. So I'm going to change the weight to 0 and I'm going to enable sheen. So let's open up this sheen tab and I'll change the weight to 1. And you can see already how it's filling the fabric, but it's filling it more from the back as opposed to like an overall reflection. And I'm just going to jump to my more kind of zoomed in camera and we can see how this is working. So if I was to change the roughness of the sheen to 0 or 0.1, you're going to see now it's a lot less diffused. And if I change this to something like 0.5, it's now kind of scattering that light throughout the whole fabric. We can kind of dial this in until we get a value we're happy with. I'm going to get a ramp node. So I'm going to double click to bring out the menu, type in ramp, and let's plug the roughness texture into the input, solo this ramp node. We can have a look at this roughness map and it's so bright, it just looks like a solid white mask. So let's actually clamp down this ramp. Let's really clamp down that black color. We can start to see some of that detail come in. So I think we could probably drop this white value down a little bit more. Let's go maybe something like 35, because basically the brighter the value, the more rough it's going to be, the darker the value, the glossier it's going to be. And I want to strike a balance in between. So let's plug this ramp into the sheen roughness. We'll unsolo the ramp node and let's have a look at how this is looking. Okay, cool. So that is looking quite glossy, and maybe that means we need to increase the value back up to 50. Let's have a look and see how that affects it. So that's a little bit more diffused, and I think that's a good amount of roughness. The issue now is that because the color of the sheen is white, it does have quite a glossy appearance to it. So what we could do is we could come down to the sheen color, and we could just dial in a similar color to the diffuse. So like this greenish kind of color. Maybe we make it a little bit darker as well. And you can see straight away now, we're getting that backscatter effect from the sheen, but it blends in well with the color of the fabric, which is perfect. And that is the basic principle for building a fabric shader. Obviously it depends on the look you're going for. Like a velvet would obviously feel a lot more glossy, so would a silk, but something like this does have quite a rough, diffused look to it. Now, I actually don't want to use the color texture for the base color of this material, so I'm actually going to double click the wire to delete it, and I'm actually going to then also take the color out of the sheen. And the reason for that is because I want to dive into a technique which we're going to use pretty heavily over the build of this garment, and that is vertex maps. So we can use this to blend between different materials and also just create a really nice procedural workflow to building our materials. So the way we can do this is pretty easy. Let's select our alembic garment. We're going to press Shift C and we're going to type vertex map, and we're going to press enter, and this has now applied a vertex map to our object. So now you can see it's gone completely red, and this basically means that we have a mask over our object. Now you can see we now have this painting tool, and I could actually paint on this object if I wanted to and create some custom masks, but I don't want to do that. I actually want to use some fields to create our mask. So you can see in the render I did before this tutorial, kind of like the test render, we have this red to kind of like a faded red gradient going up the trousers. Same with the wool on the left hand side, and we're going to do this with this vertex map. So whilst we have it selected, I'm just going to rename it and call it gradient. And let's go back to fields, and I'm just going to click linear field. You can see now it's created this field, really small field here on the X axis. And we actually want to change this to the Y axis, which is as simple as going to direction, changing it to Y plus. And now we just need to move the linear field into place. So I'm going to go into my front view, and I'm using the middle mouse to go between these different views, but you can also just press this icon in the top right here. So I'm going to move this linear field to be in the middle of our object, and I'm also going to scale up the length so that it kind of hits the top and the bottom of our object. Something like that looks good. And now you can see we have this lovely red to yellow fall off. So now we have that set up, what we can basically do is go to our material, double click and search for vertex attribute. And we are then going to drag and drop our vertex map into the attribute name. And if I was to solo this node and play the render view, and what we should see is we have a black to white gradient. Now we can use this for all sorts. We can use it to blend between materials, but in this case, I'm going to use it for the color of this fabric. So I'm going to double click again and get a ramp node, and let's plug this vertex map into general input alt input, and we'll solo the ramp node, and you'll notice that it's going to actually clamp the colors. And this is because the ramp by default uses a smooth interpolation. I actually want to change this to linear, and now it should go back to the original color. Once that's in place, I'm actually going to change the black to like a nice vibrant red color, something like this potentially. And then let's have it fade to like a desaturated kind of orangey color, maybe something like this. Let that update. And now we have something like that. So once we have that set up, we can plug this ramp into the base color of our standard material. And I'm actually going to clamp this ramp. So let's just bring that color in a little bit to make it more vibrant on the bottom, and we'll do the same with the top just so we get a little bit more vibrant orange at the bottom. And if we unsolo this node, what we should see now is we have this lovely kind of gradient color from bottom to top, which is what we're seeing. So that's amazing. We know it's working. The next thing I want to do is I actually want to use this same color and plug it into the sheen. So I'm going to double click and get a color correct, because what you'll see is if I plug the exact same color into the sheen and into the sheen color, you're not going to see any sort of sheen going on at all because it's matching the exact same color as the diffuse. So what I want to do is I want to run this ramp through a color correct. And if I just solo this, I'm going to desaturate it slightly, maybe to something like 0.6. And I'm also going to boost the gamma to 1.5. So it's much brighter. So now if I plug this into the sheen color and I unsolo it, we should get some of that sheen come back through. And we could probably actually increase this now. So let's drop down to the sheen and to the weight, and let's maybe put that to like 0.8, and that should just lift that sheen ever so slightly. You don't really see it too much because of the displacement and the normal map, and it breaks up the sheen anyway, but it's still good to have that there just to add some of that backscatter effect. We have this lovely fabric going across our whole garment from bottom to top, but in the example you can see I've actually got three materials going on here. I've got this fabric texture, I've got this translucent, and I've got this like shiny metal texture going on as well. So we want to be able to blend between all three of these. The first thing we want to do is be able to isolate this fabric texture just to the trousers. Just like we did with this gradient vertex map, we're going to use a vertex map to create a mask for the trousers, which we can then use to blend the materials. So I'm going to pause the render view just so the PC doesn't fall apart. And let's select our alembic object again, press Shift C and search for vertex map. That will create a new vertex map, and let's just name this trousers. And this is when the polygon selection tags come in useful, which we had transferred over from the OBJ. So I'm going to find the one which I believe is called trousers, which is this one here. I'm just going to drag and drop that into the fields tab of our vertex map. So let's drag and drop that in, and you can see straight away we have now a mask for the trousers, and we can use this to blend our Redshift material. So in order to do that, we're going to have to create a material blender. So let's just double click and get a material blender, and let's control drag our current material. So I'll just drag that there, and let's put this new one into the base color, and let's put our current fabric texture into layer 1 of the material blender. And now if I plug the material blender into the surface, what we should see is that we're actually only seeing the base color from the material blender. And that's because if we look at the material blender node, our layer 1, which is our fabric material, has a blend color of black. So if I was to change this to 100%, you can see now we have a completely white color, and we can almost imagine this as an opacity slider. So if I change this to 50%, this fabric material on layer 1 would have a 50% opacity. So it'd almost be a blend of the base color and layer 1. Now, what you'll notice is that we can actually input our own texture into this blend color, and this is where we're going to use the vertex map to blend it. So if I double click, search for vertex attribute, and I drag and drop our trousers vertex map into the attribute name, we can now plug this into the blend color of our material blender. And what we should see is that now we have the fabric isolated to the trousers, and the rest of the material is now just this new standard material, which is just a normal gray material. Now this is the basic kind of technique for this material builder that we're going to work on now, and we're going to use different vertex maps in order to create materials for different sections of this garment. Now the one thing you'll notice is that we still have the fabric texture mapped across the whole garment, even though the fabric texture is only kind of isolated to the trouser section, and that's because the displacement isn't actually part of the material. As we demonstrated earlier, this displacement is plugged into the displacement of the output, so it's affecting the whole object. We need to find a way to mask this to the trousers, and it's pretty easy. All we're going to do is we're going to double click and get a displacement blender, and instead of plugging this displacement into the base input, which would mean that we have no way to affect the blend weight, we're actually going to put it into layer 0. So if I plug that into layer 0 input, and I can now have the ability to put in a blend weight just like we did with a material blender. And as you can probably guess, we're going to plug in the vertex attribute into the blend weight, and now if I output this displacement blender to the displacement of this output, we should now isolate that fabric just to the trousers, which we can now see. If I zoom in a bit further, you can see that now we should just see the fabric on our trousers, just what I wanted. Okay, so let's look at building the shiny material for the arms, and you can probably already imagine how we can build this. But we're going to create a new vertex map for the object. So again, selecting the alembic, Shift C to bring up the menu, vertex map, and let's name this one arms. And we just need to find the right polygon selection. Unfortunately, because this is an alembic and not an OBJ, when we double click these polygon selections, we actually can't see anything. So the best way to visualize these is to actually select our vertex map, go to fields, and just drag and drop the polygon selection in. And luckily, this first one I dragged in is the one I wanted. It's just the kind of outside selection of the arms. And now we can use this as a mask in our material. So let's try tidy things up just a little bit, although there's not really much I can do. So let's delete that. We don't need that anymore. Move that around. That can come up here. That can go there. So we're gonna have to make a new material. So let's just control drag one of these standard materials, and let's plug this into layer 2 material color of our material blender. And we're gonna control drag a current vertex attribute, but this time we'll drag in a new arms vertex map, and we'll use this to blend our new layer 2 material. So layer 2 blend color, and we're not going to see anything because this material is still exactly the same as the base material. But if I was to increase the metalness to 1, what we should see is that now we just have it applied to where our vertex map is. And a good way to visualize this is if we go to our vertex attribute and press the S icon, we can solo it, and that will show us the white mask from the vertex. So now we have this metal material. And what we could do is we could increase the brightness of the color to something like 74. I find that the materials are always quite dark by default, so I like to brighten them up a little bit. I actually want it to take a similar color to the gradient. So what we could do is we could take the ramp we made for our fabric material and plug this into the color of our kind of metal material, and now that will follow the same gradient we made for the rest of the garment. So that looks pretty good to me. To be honest, I'm pretty happy with that. We did disable the reflection earlier, obviously because I was showing you the sheen. So let's re-enable that and see how that affects our metal. And it doesn't make too much of a difference. It kind of just adds like a secondary reflection on top of the metalness. It's completely up to you whether or not you want to have that. It kind of just brightens it up a little bit. I'm actually going to leave it on. I think it looks quite nice. I'm pretty happy with that. The final material is this translucent refractive material, and there's a few ways to tackle this. Each of them has their own advantages. Predominantly, it's going to be to do with how long you can afford your render times to be, because the three methods we have for creating a translucent material like this is either using transmission, using subsurface, or we can enable thin walled, which will essentially turn our subsurface into a translucency slider. So let's start off with using it as a transmissive material. All we're going to do is change the weight to 1, and that should just give us like a glass material, which we can see here. And what's important to note about this is that if we enable our cloth surface, which obviously adds thickness to our object, that's going to give us a more realistic glass material, or like a more realistic transmissive material, because now our garment has some thickness to it. So if we just give that a second to update, we should see that it kind of changes the refractions and the overall look of that material. But also be cautious that this will obviously impact render times. It's going to take a lot longer to render. So I'm going to disable cloth surface for now. So yeah, you can see that's updated again, and now it kind of feels more plasticky, more like a thin window pane almost. So let's look at the next method we could do. So if I disable transmission, and I'm also going to disable diffuse for this, and let's enable subsurface. Now they introduced the new subsurface mode called random walk, which is a really good subsurface model, and it just looks way more realistic. It's quicker to calculate, and it just gives you really nice results. And you can see straight away off the bat, we're getting quite like a milky material from it almost, where we can't really see through it now. We can see through it a little bit, but it's very bright. And it just looks, yeah, like I said, very milky. So we could dial in some color into the subsurface. So for example, I could change the color to like this reddish color, and we might have to go quite saturated with this. And we can start to see now we have like this red tint to the subsurface. And then I like to think of this radius as like a secondary color for the subsurface. So if I change this to like an orange color, it's gonna add like those yellowy orangey undertones. And you can see actually now it's kind of taken over the subsurface. So you can use the saturation to kind of dial in the balance between the subsurface color and the radius. So if I was to dial back the saturation of this to like 25, now it's going back to that reddish tint we originally had. And this is looking pretty good. So that's the subsurface method. That one will be quicker to render than the transmission method, but obviously this one feels a lot more diffused, a lot more frosted. So it depends on the look you want to go for. Final method is to enable thin walled at the bottom, which essentially is going to tell Cinema 4D that the geometry you're using has no thickness to it. And you can see now that the subsurface has grayed out all these additional options, and we only have a weight slider. So if I change this back to white and leave the weight at 1, what we should see is that we get quite a similar result to the subsurface, but actually what's happening is it's just adding translucency to our material. So obviously with a weight of 1 and a color of completely 100% white, we're getting a completely translucent material, which actually looks quite nice in this case, and this would be the quickest to render out of the three. So it really depends on the look you want to go for. We could decrease the roughness of the reflection, and that may help to make it a little bit more translucent without the roughness, but actually it kind of looks a bit darker, so maybe not. Put that back up to 0.2. Now when we tint this subsurface color, it kind of just tints the whole object. Whereas with the subsurface, it was very dependent on the lighting, overall like volume and shape of the object as to like how the light was being scattered. whereas this just gives it like an overall tint. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just leave it on this kind of thin walled subsurface, just because it's the quickest to render. It's not going to be too heavy. But instead of just selecting a color from this, again, I'm going to go back to that original ramp we made, and I'm going to plug that into the subsurface. And what we should see now is that we have this kind of gradient translucency going through. And at the moment, this looks way too vibrant. So let's again get a color correct node. And actually, we could use the one we already set up earlier. Let's see how this looks if we plug that into the subsurface color, where it's just slightly desaturated. And that might be a little bit too desaturated, but it still has like a slightly warmer tint to it, which is quite nice. So maybe what we'll do is we'll control drag the color correct, put the ramp into this new one, and let's just bring a little bit of that saturation back. So maybe 0.8, and let's plug that into the subsurface color. And let's just refresh the render view because I think it's bugging out a little bit. We can drop it back down to 0.6. Maybe that's still a bit too saturated. Let's go 0.3. Okay, and let's also drop down the gamma because now it's like super bright with the translucency, which is giving us these really bright areas at the top. And I think this is looking pretty good. So I'm going to show the environment. So I'm just going to untick the traffic icons, go back to the original camera, and see how this looks when we have the rest of the scene in place. And now we can see this kind of subsurface scattering is actually looking quite dark, and it's looking a little bit dirty. So let's see if we can fix that by boosting the gamma back up. Let's go back up to 2, and that should brighten that up a little bit. Maybe we can go 2.2. And actually, I'd be tempted to bring some of that saturation back in, just so that at least we have a little bit of color in there. Let's refresh the render view. And I think that looks pretty good. I do just quickly want to try the transmission method again. So I'm going to disable thin walled. I'm going to disable subsurface, even though that actually looks quite good. And let's enable transmission. And we're going to have to enable the cloth surface in order for the refractions to calculate properly. So let's have a look at that. Give that a second to update. This might be a little bit heavy, but we'll see. Okay, doesn't look like it's made too much of a difference. Let's enable reflection, and I think we could increase the roughness. So I don't want to increase the roughness of the reflection because I quite like this glossy look. So we can actually use the extra roughness in the transmission, and maybe we're going to add an extra 0.2 roughness. Maybe we can actually go 0.3, and yeah, I think that looks pretty good. I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to dial in this new color correct node into the transmission color. So let's do that. And now I'm definitely going to take out some of that saturation. Let's put it down to like 0.1. I think something gone weird because it just looks super dirty at the moment. So let's see what has gone horribly wrong. Okay, I think maybe we could boost the level scale up. Let's boost the level scale up to like 2. Okay, that's obviously way too bright. Let's drop both of these down to 1.5, the gamma and the level. See if we can get it to a reasonable scale. Drop the gamma down to 1. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good. It's kind of hard to tell with such a grainy render, but this is looking good to me. So I think that's basically the setup for the garments. Now I want to go over some cool techniques we can do for texturing the rest of this scene. So thank you for watching today's video. I hope you found it helpful and packed full of knowledge which you can apply to your own work. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is a snippet from a Patreon collaboration with Steffi Fung, where we went through actually creating this garment and animating it, and then obviously creating the scene in Cinema 4D and rendering it. So in the rest of my part of this series, we talked about texturing the scene, doing final lighting and Redshift post effect settings, and then actually rendering this out. So if any of that interests you, definitely go and check out the Patreon. Thank you for watching the video. Enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world, and I will catch you in the next one. Peace.